I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. The clock is ticking down. Voters go to the polls June 22nd in a very consequential Democratic primary. The winner is likely our next mayor. Early voting has been underway since June 12th. Lots of developments in recent weeks. Eric Adams, the leader in most polls, was accused of not living full-time in New York. He does co-own a co-op in Fort Lee, New Jersey, actually gave a tour of his Brooklyn apartment to prove his residency, an issue in the latest debate. Progressive powerhouse Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez endorsed Maya Wiley for mayor, giving Wiley's campaign a big shot in the arm. And there's a new Marist poll, Adams in first with 24%, Catherine Garcia second with 17, Wiley 15, Andrew Yang sinking to fourth place with 13. But with crime now a big issue, the mayor's race is a big test for progressives, voters more focused on practical matters like public safety than on woke ideology. Another big question, of course, the impact of ranked choice voting. Is being the second choice of a lot of people more valuable than being the first choice of, say, 20% of all voters? Is this a potential path to victory for Catherine Garcia? Lots to discuss with Jeff Mays, a political reporter with the New York Times, Dana Rubinstein, also a Metro political reporter with the Times, and Eleanor Randolph, a contributing writer for the Times and author of The Many Lives of Michael Bloomberg, now out in paperback. Eleanor, what do you think is going to be the biggest variable in this race? There's so many things that are on the table: the last debate, union endorsements, editorial endorsements, minority voting. Obviously, the biggest factor is, of course, who comes out and votes, who is dragooned to the polls by the various unions and whatnot. What do you think is going to be the deciding factor?
Traditionally, or at least in the last couple of primaries for mayor and comptroller, big primaries, not enough people have voted. So when there are fewer people, it sort of skews the way the election goes. And one of the things that we're starting to see is how complicated the actual voting is. I mean, I talked to somebody the other day who had just on the first day of early voting went in and she said, this is a very, very smart person. I won't name her, but she said, the ballots stuck together. It was a mess. I took forever. There were people screaming. And, I think it is an uncommonly complicated election. I have to say, otherwise I'll be in big trouble, that I've been working with Citizens Union to set up this website called electnyc.org. And what we're trying to do is sort of unconfuse a lot of the election goings on and to give people an idea about who all the candidates are and how you vote. The ranked choice voting, that's the X factor in this election. Is Catherine Garcia, you mentioned her. Part of what we're hearing from her is that she wants it to be everybody's second place, because as candidates drop out, whoever you put in second place will move over to count for the candidates who still exist. It's going to be a nightmare for the Board of Elections, but it'll be really interesting for data nerds and mathematicians and analytics and people like that.
And people like us, of course.
Oh yeah,
That's all assuming nobody gets 50% on the first round, which is a good assumption. But Jeff Mays, is Eric Adams still the man to beat?
Absolutely. I mean, the latest Marist poll just confirmed that. He's at 24%, and Catherine Garcia was at 17, I believe. and Maya Wiley was close behind that. So he is definitely the front runner. We saw that with the last debate. He took a lot of attacks, people talking about whether he actually lived in the city, talking about his campaign finance reports. So yeah, and I expect the same thing from the debate this week. I expect him to be treated again as the front runner that he is, and to have some of these candidates now, particularly Catherine Garcia and Maya Wiley, continue to come after him. Maya Wiley has been criticizing Mr. Adams for his position on crime and public safety. Eric Adams said that, stop and frisk can be used legally and safely. He wants to bring back plainclothes anti-crime units. And of course, that's one of the reasons he's the front runner, because we've seen rising incidents of violent crime. And his message is that his background as a police officer, but also as someone who was abused by police as a teenager, and someone who spoke out against discriminatory policing when he was in the police department, gives him the best background to be able to balance both public safety while also preserving people's rights.
Dana, what do you think appeals to people most in this campaign? I've been reasonably good at handicapping prior campaigns. I always thought there was a certain rationale to the way people voted all the way back, how they figured out what kind of candidate they wanted at what time. But I have to admit, this time I'm a little bit baffled. Obviously, as Eleanor says, the ranked choice voting complicates things. But even without that, when you come after Bill de Blasio in a whole stream of mayors, it's tough to figure out this time, particularly after the pandemic, what is it that people are looking for in a mayor? Are they looking for an outsider? Are they looking for someone, given the state of the economy, who can bring the city back? Are they looking for a woman? Are they looking for a minority? What do you think people want in the next mayor?
Well, I think the three leading candidates, if you exclude Yang, which maybe is unwise to do, but the three leading candidates attest to three different desires on the part of the electorate. So Adams, I think, is doing so well because people are concerned about public safety. I mean, that's been shown in various polls, and I think his rise in the polls is evidence of that. Garcia, I think people, I think she seems like a stable, undramatic choice and a competent choice. And I think her rise is probably a reaction to the widespread perception that de Blasio is many things, but a particularly good, effective manager is not necessarily one of them. And then with Maya Wiley, there are a lot of progressives in New York City in the Democratic primary, and they're coalescing behind her. And she really is the only candidate, certainly the only viable one, who is at this point still talking about really defunding the NYPD in a real way, although even her discussion of that is kind of vague and it's imprecise.
Eleanor, since you mentioned Elect NYC, I will give you this assignment if I may, and you could duck it if you want to, but can you explain to our viewers just how ranked choice voting works?
Oh, that is the meanest question. Well, basically, the hardest part of it will not happen when you go to the polls. The most difficult part of ranked choice voting goes to our lovely Board of Elections, which is going to have to count this. And so we'll just put that aside for a second. When you go to the polls, you will have this grid, and you will be asked to pick at least one, of course, but you can pick up to 5 candidates. You don't have to pick 5 candidates, but if you pick, Paperboy Prince as your number 1 candidate, and he gets knocked out, or, they get knocked out very early, if you have put in a second choice, say your second choice is maybe Yang, that vote will actually go to Andrew Yang. And so you're going to see, if you vote 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, your vote can last a lot longer, even if your number 1 gets bumped out, probably even if your number 2 gets bumped out. Now, if one of these candidates gets 50 plus 1%, 50% plus one, I should say, then, you know, it's out the window. That person wins and they have the Democratic primary, and you know, probably they'll win in November as and be our next mayor. But for the voter, it's just to concentrate on that grid and to try to think who are your top, who are your favorites, who are your top 5 favorites. And I know I have, you know, the Board of Elections has sent out this little folder that gives you the grid and everything like that. And I would suggest, as you're working on that, use a pencil with an eraser, because I can tell you I have moved people around 2 or 3 times. But as I said, for the vote, if you want to go in and just vote for one person, that's fine. But it's better for you and better for the city if you vote for more than one.
Jeff Mays, I don't want to sound skeptical or cynical, but are we going to know the results the night of the primary?
I mean, I think our understanding from the Board of Elections is we might know who initially, you know, on the first ballot, but it's going to take them a while to do the tabulations and calculations, the ranked choice calculations. So, I mean, I think it'll probably be at least a week or 2 before we have any sort of solid results on that. And that's something I think that the Board of Elections needs to start preparing New York residents for. That, look, normally in the past, you know, we could tell you on primary night most times, you know, who the winner is. And as Eleanor said, you know, whoever wins the Democratic primary likely wins the mayoralty. But I think people need to be prepared that this is a process, because it's a new process. It's going to take a while for them to figure out, to go through the tabulations. The board recently got some software that will help them do that. So hopefully this will go smoothly. The biggest thing they need is some transparency. And my understanding is they do plan to be transparent, let the public know, you know, the different rounds, the different calculations. So yes, I think that's, people should be prepared for a slight wait.
That's a long wait for election results. Dana, is Scott Stringer out of the race? He was a front runner early on. Is he gone?
I mean, he's still running. I think that it's a pretty safe bet to say that he is not going to be mayor. I mean, you never know, of course. He could be a bunch of second or third choices for voters. But yeah, I think he's been really damaged by these allegations, and a lot of people who have endorsed or had endorsed Stringer have now gravitated to Maya Wiley, much as a lot of people who endorsed Diane Morales have gravitated to Maya Wiley, given the unrest within her own campaign. So yeah, I mean, Maya Wiley is now considered the leading progressive choice for mayor, and she's working hard to coalesce that support behind her.
Eleanor, what can we expect, do you think, in the last couple of days of this campaign? Is there going to be any mid-June surprise? Is there anything the candidates can do to really change the balance in the election?
You know, that's a good question. I think, you know, I've been surprised at the negativity in this campaign. I mean, one of the things that we thought would happen with ranked choice voting was that everybody would be, the candidates would be nicer to each other because they'd need the second choice, or, you know, need you to pair up with them to actually win. But this has been quite negative. And, you know, Eric Adams is taking one shot after another. And I mean, that's normal really for a front runner. Whether he can sustain his position will be really interesting to me. I think I was thinking about Scott Stringer, what Dana was talking about. It's very interesting. You know, comptrollers have not done well running for mayor. And the
They
last
haven't done
one,
well being mayor either.
the last one was Abe Beam. You're right, you know, and so it's very, I mean, those candidates for comptroller who are secretly hoping that this is the stepping stone to mayor just should start looking at the history here.
Jeff, we often talk about block voting, I think sometimes naively, but is there a minority vote in this election? Is there a Black and Hispanic vote? And of course, an Asian vote as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. I think, Black people make up just over a quarter of the electorate. And you see Maya Wiley and Eric Adams, I wrote a story about how they are going after that vote very carefully, and they're using the issue of policing, public safety, and civil rights. And they both have sort of different views, as I discussed earlier. And Maya is more on the progressive end when it comes to some of those policing issues. She has talked about defunding the police. She's talked about moving more money into mental health services and other things that will actually help prevent crime. Whereas Eric Adams is saying, we need to do both. We need to focus on public safety and also protecting people's civil rights. So definitely, I think, whoever wins a good chunk of that Black electorate definitely has a good chance at winning this primary. There's also been a real push for the Latino vote right now. People like Andrew Yang have been going really hard after the Latino vote. Eric Adams is releasing this week a slew of media, Spanish language media, and Scott Stringer, of course, has been releasing Spanish language media for a few weeks now. So absolutely, those are two important coalitions in the city. They tend to help whoever is the mayor win if you can get enough of them to line up behind you.
Thank you, Jeff Mays, Eleanor Randolph, Dana Rubinstein of the New York Times. And coming up next, the top crime books to read this summer. We're just days away from the official start of summer, and that means lots of folks looking for books to read. Crime books are always among the most popular. That being the case, we've got exactly the right person on deck. Sarah Weinman writes the crime column for the New York Times Book Review. She's also the award-winning author of her own books and has edited a wide range of crime anthologies. In addition, she writes the appropriately titled Crime Lady newsletter. We're pleased to welcome Sarah Weinman. Her column appears twice a month in the New York Times Book Review. Sarah, Marilyn Stasio wrote that column in the Times since 1988, and she said she was fascinated by crime ever since she read the encyclopedia and she saw the picture of the two princes in the tower who were plotting to kill Richard III, their uncle. What got you interested in crime?
I feel like I had not an exact similar origin story to Marilyn in terms of interest in crime, but I too have been fascinated with crime stories of all kinds since I was a child. And my own, I suppose, origin story began a little fancifully, not with the regular encyclopedia, but with a baseball encyclopedia. And I was around 8 years old. And I had this notion that I wanted to look up which ball players had died, and especially which ones had died rather untimely deaths. And so after reading about this, I presented this at dinner to my parents, and to their credit, they took it rather well. And I wouldn't say that they encouraged me in the pursuit of crime as an educational gambit, but they also were very encouraging of my interests in general. And so more seriously, I was a serious crime reader in high school and especially in college. And when I moved to New York 20 years ago, it was to pursue a master's degree in forensic science. So there's always been this kind of crime thing going on in my professional life. And over the decade and a half or so that I've been writing and reviewing crime, I feel like that's just been a very important part of my life and my element.
Why do people read crime books?
I think for a number of reasons. Crime fiction and nonfiction crime stories too, they offer a window on society, and they tell stories that help people understand why people engage in the most extreme behavior and how gossamer thin the line is between, I suppose, staying on the morally right course of life and tipping over into doing something which might be perceived as awful, but also has some underlying societal, familial, and other factors. And so crime stories are a window into the way that humans behave and how humans behave in the most extreme way.
Is there a trend in crime books? Do the books become perhaps more thoughtful, more psychological, more cerebral in a sense, and less bloody, or does that not happen?
I think it depends. At the moment, if there's one trend that I'm starting to identify, it's the confluence of real life crime mixing with crime fiction types of narratives. So there are a couple of books that I've either reviewed or am set to review that take on what I call the true crime industrial complex. And because true crime has been in this ongoing moment that in the anthology that I edited last year, Unspeakable Acts, I identified as starting more or less around the time when the podcast Serial launched in the fall of 2014. I mean, true crime has been having a moment for hundreds of years, if not more. But I think the mix of participation, online elements, people feeling as if they're personally invested in crimes, the advent of new technologies, all of that has created the sense that there is a new market and a new appetite for crime stories, but that people are feeling personally invested in those stories as well. And so that's starting to migrate over into crime fiction as well. And so I'm interested in that as someone who writes and edits true crime stories in addition to reviewing crime novels. And I think we'll see more of that. But I also think with the world being so chaotic and there's so much upheaval, we're still in a pandemic, even though many of us are fully vaccinated and starting to live quote unquote normal lives. But crime stories are a way to reckon with what we've been experiencing and also a means of escape. So there's no accident that a number of books that I have reviewed are in the so-called cozy mystery realm that are more about family and community and feeling a sense of togetherness at a time when we've been so isolated and are only starting to feel that togetherness in real life.
You reviewed The Last Thing He Told Me by Laura Dave, and you said her characters, even when they behave monstrously, don't fall into that hero-villain binary comparison. How does a monstrous character not be a villain?
I think it's a matter of when people do monstrous things or behave in monstrous ways, but is anyone really a monster? We all start out as humans, and in fiction, it's really important to convey that characters are three-dimensional beings, and that's really important to me as a crime reader and reviewer, that I feel as if I have some investment and that I care about the people that I'm reading about. So with quote unquote monsters who are these two-dimensional figures, it's very easy to kind of check out and not care. And so what I really appreciated about what Laura Dave did in her novel, which is her first suspense novel after a number of years writing more non-crime commercial women's fiction, is that the characters really, their behavior is rooted in the ways that we would recognize. And so when they do bad things, we also understand why they do that.
You're the editor of Troubled Daughters, Twisted Wives, stories from trailblazers of domestic suspense. Do women commit crime in different ways from men?
That's an interesting question. I want to say that the answer is nuanced in that in some ways they do, and in some ways they do not. Some of it is a question of how they were operating in society at the time. That anthology, which was published by Penguin in 2013, had a very specific mandate of republishing stories by women crime writers from the early 1940s to the mid 1970s. So that was a period of time when women's roles in society were changing and they were able to work and able to get credit cards and having a little bit more emancipation from men and some independence, but also a lot of fraught sense of their own identities and how things were working, but also especially how they weren't working. And that's a good recipe for danger and especially for suspense. And so the ways in which they might manifest their own desires and own rage perhaps are different than men at that time period. But
Sarah-
now,
Mhm.
maybe not so much.
Sarah, if you could recommend one beach book for this summer, what would it be?
Ah, that's an excellent question. I think it may be one that I did not review, but which I read and am so excited for people to read. It's Dream Girl by Laura Lipman. It'll be out on Tuesday. Laura's a dear friend, I should disclose that. But I feel like it's a book that really gets at the heart of what it is to be a writer, to be creative, to also have rage, and to feel as if one could be in the midst of escape and trying to make sense of it. And then for something a little bit lighter, I also very heartily recommend Arsenic and Adobo by Mia P. Mananzala, which is just a delightful confection. And I think that so many people would enjoy reading that.
And very quickly, Stacey Abrams' book, While Justice Sleeps.
Ah, yes, that's a wonderful book as well. That really fulfilled so many of my desires as a reader. It was just super fun and really propulsive and so enjoyable. And yes, that's definitely one that for those who are embarking on cruises or sitting by the beach, that's one you definitely want to take with.
Thanks for joining us, Sarah Weinman, the crime books in the New York Times Book Review. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.